Okay, Rabbi said we're on top of page Tuf Tzadik. We're on top of page Tuf Tzadik. I was here Tuesday, right? Tuesday we learned. It seems like so long ago. When my school year started, Mitzvah next week, it starts in full. But in yeshiva I'm already teaching, so the time slows down. A lot more happens between one day and the next. Anyway, we're in the middle of a letter. This is like, I think, our fourth time we're touching on this letter. And I don't mind wasting time on a letter like this. The letter was written to Rabbi Ebrimson, as I explained to you. Rabbi Ebrimson was a Tomim, learned on Lubavitch. He was a Lamdin and a Rov. He was a real Rov, which is a very, very serious denotation. I told this before, I saw correspondence of his where he was struggling with the standards of kashrus and mikveh. The community was neglected, and he had to set it right. And when you come in as a Rov and you find institutional chesrenis, they're very hard to correct, and it looks like he had to fight a battle with Mizrach. Durach Tzefirin, the Meratzen from the Meibishn. Reb Osher Ebrimson was his name, Abramson. So I think he lived in Sydney, maybe later. This was a letter about Melbourne. They were building a yeshiva. So in conjunction with the idea of building a yeshiva, the Rebbe is discussing with him the inyan of the yeshiva. As I explained to you last week, the Rebbe had a habit in the earlier years, when he had more time, I suppose, that there were things the Rebbe wanted to talk about. So he would find a person that was holding by understanding it, and he would write it there. And this whole page is unnecessary. This page is a Dvarteira. In other words, the Rebbe answered his questions on the previous page, on Tov Peites. Here, the Rebbe is pashat schmoozing about the inyan of Taras HaKodesh. And I explained it to you. First of all, the mashal. In Jewish life today, what tumah do we have? We have nida. That's a serious tumah. We have no other tumah. We don't worry about any other tumah. Okay, we don't go to the Beis HaMikdash. If you lived in Israel and you separated matanis, that means truma and ma'aser sheni, you would not eat it, chas v'shalom. If a kohen eats truma, his tummy is chayiv misa b'dei shamayim. You burn it. And I don't know all the halachas of how Eretz Yisrael works. They're paid it, and they destroy the money. I don't know the dinim. This many Rabbonim, this is already not new. Jews have lived in Israel for a very, very long time. And a long time ago, that means 100 years ago, let's say, Rabbonim, wrote dinim hashayachim la'aretz. But aside from that, we don't have tumah in Tana. Times of the Beis HaMikdash, there were 5 levels. There were 6 levels. There was chulin, that means food that's ordinary, prosta, plain. Then there was, whatever it is, there's ma'aser sheni and eteravoy. Then there's truma. Truma is what the kohen eats. The kohen's food is called taharos, pure. And it's very serious that they have to be tahir. Then above that you have what's called koshim kalim, karbones that are holy, but you can eat the meat in the whole city of Yerushalayim. Higher than that is Kodesh Kodoshim, the Holy of Holies, which not has to be eaten in Yerushalayim, has to be eaten in the Azorah, has to be eaten in the Beis HaMikdash. And understand, they ate it standing up. You're not allowed to sit in the Azorah except you are Melech Yisrael. I'm thinking about it out loud. They would stand and eat. That's it. In Shulchan Aruch it says standing and eating is not good. When you were a little child, you said your parents told you eat standing up, you'll get fat feet. But the Kohanim ate tons of food, a lot of food, in the Azorah, and you're not allowed to sit. The only person who was allowed to sit in the Azorah was the Malchi Beis David, the kings from the family of David HaMelech, because the Beis HaMikdash is called the house of David, so they were allowed to sit. It's called Kodesh Kodeshim, and then even higher than Kodesh Kodeshim is called Paras Chatas, the Parah Duma. And there's very complicated halachas about how tumah is transferred. There's what's called tumah, there's called psul, all kinds of halachas. Then, of course, in the time of the second Beis HaMikdash, you had the problem with amaratzim, who were not careful about trumas ma'aser. So they introduced what's called chavrus. It's a very interesting concept, and I would argue it's the antithesis of the Lubavitcher philosophy of today. The Lubavitcher philosophy of today is that all Jews are good and all Jews are the same. Chavros was a club. Chavros means a member of the Chaverim, of the friends. Chaverim accepted upon themselves higher standards. They were careful about Dmai, and they introduced a new idea in the time of the second Beis Hamikdash. And it was called Chulin al Taharas HaKodesh. That even when you ate regular food, it wasn't a korban, it wasn't truma, it wasn't ma'aser sheni, it wasn't netar avoah, you ate it al Taharas HaKodesh, as if it was a korban. So there were people, if they would become tamei, they would have special pots for times of tumah, special food for time of tumah. I'm not talking about kohenim. A kohen is not allowed to be tamei. A Yisrael is allowed to be tamei unless it's Yom Tov. And as soon as they could, they would go to the mikveh, and they would wait till nightfall, and then they had special kelim that were al Taharas HaKodesh, that they would only eat food, they would always eat as if they were eating karbanos, which is a big chumrah. It made life very hard for them. And they were called chaverim. And a series of dinim about how you makabel chavros, how you become a member of this chaverim club, and how you can be disposed of a member of a chaverim club. And then, of course, there's the question of Eishes chaver kechaver, the wife of a chaver is a chaver, the children of a chaver is a chaver, all these different halachas. If a girl came from a very choshev mishpacha, and her parents were chaverim, and she married a simple guy who was an amorat who was not a chaver, is she still a chaver because of her upbringing, or does she follow her husband? Or if I can't, a fellow who came from a family of chaverim, and therefore we presume that he's also a chaver, he marries a girl that comes from a family of maratzim. What's her halacha? These things are actually discussed in Rambam and discussed in halacha. They're not negay at all b'zman hazeh, because we don't have chavres. We have no tahara b'chlal, except, like I said before, be'ikid tumas nida and keri. So now, we don't have these concepts. We certainly don't have a concept of chulin al Taharas HaKodesh, that even my regular food is going to have Taharas HaKodesh. But we have a spiritual equivalent of that. And the spiritual equivalent of that is called chinuch al Taharas HaKodesh. That we raise our children, so there's chulin, and then there's taharis, and there's kachim kalim, and there's kachim kachim, and there's parim chatas, and there's a shita that says chulin al chinuch al Taharas HaKodesh. When I'm raising my little children, I want their education to be pure and holy, or to be purely holy, which is what the word al Taharas HaKodesh actually means. Absolutely holy, purely holy, al Taharas HaKodesh. So the Rebbe is saying to Rabbi Abramson, who was starting literally 70 years ago, 69 years ago, a yeshiva in Melbourne, Australia, which could have been Pluto, it could have been a part of the Kuiper Belt, or whatever is floating around outside the solar system. It's so far, it was then so far away. And I told you, the Rebbe told Reb Nachum Zalman, Alav Shalom, Reb Nachum Zalman Gerevich, that if in other places of the world, being involved in chinuch is pikuach nefoshes, in Australia it's tchiyas hameisim mamish. That's what the Rebbe called it. Being involved in chinuch in Australia is tchiyas hameisim mamish. The Rebbe said it a very long time ago. The Rebbe said it more than 50 years ago. I would imagine that today the situation is, Baruch Hashem, different. Complicated, but different. Then it was, this is 70 years ago, not 50 years ago. So the Rebbe was celebrating a chinuch, a moised chinuch al Taharas HaKodesh. So the Rebbe was talking to Al-Lamton, to Yidus Ken Lenin, a Bosher. So he's writing him a letter, in the letter explaining him the Chassidus of Chinuch al Taharas HaKodesh. So we're going to start again from the top of the page. Okay, now understand, I read this first paragraph last week and I spent a whole 40 minutes on it. So we're going to go through it more quickly. I want to finish the letter today, for better or for worse. Top of the page Tov Tzadik. Goydel Ha'inyan, the great idea of Shal Yesed V'Yispatchos, of founding and expanding yeshiva al Taharas HaKodesh, and making a cheder, a yeshiva. And it's not only teaching Torah, but it's teaching Torah in a purely holy way. Now, of course, here it means no limud echol, pashut, no English, no limud echol. But Taharas HaKodesh has broader connotations. Even if you have limud echol, but that there's no weltlich hakuk. You know, that the philosophy is not worldly and modern. It's strictly Yiddishkeit. That's Taharas HaKodesh as well. It says the Rebbe asher cheimer ba'kedesh afilu mi betruma. The word kedusha applies to karbanis. When it comes to truma, we don't use the word kedusha. We use the word tahara. So imagine you're making a cheder. It's Zman HaGolus, when everybody's tummy. It's Melbourne, Australia, which might as well be Pluto. And you're making a yeshiva, not Altaris HaTahara, like Truma. Altaris HaKodesh. It should have a sanctity, a sacredness, a holiness about it. For Remez Bazeh Yadua, says the Rebbe, the spiritual parallel of this is Asher Truma Zeh Be'elam Abriya. Purity, which is the inyan of Truma, is an Elam Abriya, not Natzilus. The Kodesh, and the word, the noun of holiness. It says it's brought in Hasidus that Kodesh is Mili Begarmei. The word holy stands alone. It's not a holy chair. It's the thing of holiness. This is in the world of Atzilus. And as I explained to you last week, the difference between pure and holy. Pure is something that a person can achieve on his or her own. Holy is a gift from God. Yeah, you can make water clean. You can make wine clean. You can make oil pure. You can make your body pure. Obviously, physically, you take a shower, you're clean. But spiritually, if you're nizir, you're particular, machshava dibur or maisa, about thought, speech, and action, so then you can have a certain tahara. Holiness is not, I'm even purer. Holiness, Hashem rests on me. The Shechina Shade all love. Holiness means God is resting on this person. This is a gift. And it comes to a person not because they deserve it, because Eibishter chose. In other words, when you call a person pure, that's a very big chesed. When you call a person holy, that's a different category. It means that they're being held from the top, like the Frierdiker Rebbe told one of the Tmimim. You have to be careful. I'm being guarded. Mir hitman. Dafzach hitman. Mir hitman. I am being guarded. Holiness means that there's a koyach eliki which holds. That's atzilus, and that's kedusha. So chinuch al taras hakodesh means a chinuch of children, which is on that level. Shalachein gamkin reviu rak bakedesh, which is why there's a fourth tumah also only in karbanis, because it's connected to the fourth world, which is atzilus. The chelek hamatna bazeh b'teira, which part of teira parallels atzilus and parallels karbanis, and so on, is chelek hasei b'teira, is the level of Kabbalah. Okay, we know asher pardes the teira, the garden of teira, which is 4 levels. Pshat, Remez, Drush, Soid. So Soida, the Kabbalah, it's secret, which is Kabbalah, is in Elam Atzilus. So the Rebbe says, making yeshiva, Al Taras HaKodesh is making yeshiva in a madrega of Atzilus. It's making yeshiva in a madrega of Kabbalah, Pnimiyas HaTeira. Hainu Limud Teira, learning Teira, which is Miyusod Umuar, which is founded and irradiated, enlightened, B'mor Shabbat, with the source, with the luminary of Teira. Hu Pnimiyas Shabbat, which is the inner dimension of Teira, which is Teira Sachasidus. So you teach little kids. A Moisat Chinuch is for little kids. Or you can teach bigger kids, but ultimately we're all kids, all children. And the level of the Chinuch is going to be Chassidus. Now, how do you give Chassidus to 2-year-olds? You give them a Munah. How do you give Chassidus to 4-year-olds? You give them Yiras Shamayim, you understand? You give them a sense that all there is Hashem or Mashiach. There's the Eibishter and Mashiach, that's all there is. There's nothing else. Ein l'shayer u'lefaret. It's impossible to evaluate and to express. Afilu b'sharim k'tikonim. Even when life was normal, how big a deal it is to have a Moisad Chinuch Al Taras HaKodesh. This is the Shofar. Okay. Ubefrat b'shas cherem zu, says the Rebbe. How much more so is this true in this time? which is the time of Cherem. Cherem means emergency. I don't think today is not an emergency, but in 1950 it was so critical. I mean, the Jewish people were 7/8 dead, mamish. And the need to survive and to re-enliven ourselves was extraordinary. It says the Rebbe, "Shenispazru b'nei Yisrael l'mekemes rechekim ish meriyeu." The Jewish people have been scattered around to distant places, and we're all separate from one another. You know, one is in Australia, and one is in Italy, and one is in Brazil, and one is in Argentina, and one is in the Caribbean, and one is in New York, and one is in Montreal, and one is in San Francisco, and one is in Paris, and one is in London. Yidden are all over the place. But then the Rebbe adds, "V'nispazru gam ken koiches hanefesh." We're not only geographically scattered, we're psychologically scattered. In other words, within each person, we're split into 1,000 pieces. There should be enough copies, right? There's copies. Do you mind? Says the Rebbe, Meirev hatirdes v'hadaiges, because everybody is preoccupied. The word tirda in English, I think the best translation is preoccupation. Fanumen. That's tirda. Daige means worry. People are preoccupied, and people are worried. Be'efen mavil, in a way which is shocking. Legabi shodim she'av, when compared to earlier times. And of course, when the Rebbe says earlier times, he doesn't mean 10 years before. 10 years before was the war. He means 50 years before. He means before the revolution. He means Yidden who lived in a relatively normal, peaceful, contiguous, historically contiguous society. I always tell this to people. I sit with my Gresipka girls, and I say to them, how many of you can say that your ancestries lived in the same continent that you live 100 years ago? How many Yidden in the world can say that their ancestors 100 years ago, certainly 120 years ago, lived on the same continent where they live? 100 years ago, most of the Jews lived in North Africa and Asia Minor, Asia and Africa, and Europe. I would say 95%, 90% for sure, of the Jews of the world, starting from 1880, now it's 140 years, have been supplanted. Not they moved from Brooklyn from Borough Park to Crown Heights. They moved to a whole new world. And the way the reality is, nobody wants to say it, Ashkenazic Jews were supplanted the first half of the last century, and Sephardic Jews are the victims of the state of Israel. It's true. Eretz Yisrael displaced 2 million Sephardim. Sephardim had been living in Morocco and Tunisia and Algeria and Egypt and Syria and Jordan and Turkey and Libya for hundreds of years, and Yemen. I don't know if you can call Yemen Arab. Hundreds of years, some of them thousands of years. And the new wave of anti-Semitism, which was a response to Eretz Yisrael, displaced them. You know what happens to a person when he's displaced? His whole world is turned upside down, because we're very cultural. Yiddishkeit is not culture, it's religion. But the sustenance, the average person is frum because it's his culture. Every single Jew, Taka, thinks through every single thing. This is how you live. But when everybody's moved, and your roots are torn away, you have to make new ones. The Rebbe said you have to think of how terribly challenging the time we're living in. 70 years ago was 70 years more difficult than now. Almost all the Jews in the world had been moved from their traditional lands and traditional communities and scattered all over the world. So what percentage has enough inner fortitude not to be affected by their environment? So the Rebbe continues. Valachas kama v'kama, how much more so. Shetzorach lechapesh uvelachter, you have to search and dig, b'yigia atzuma, with great effort. Achar kol inyan hamachad, anything which can bind us together, anything which can unify one Jew with another. This is our task. Ubefrat b'Torah, particularly in Torah. Although on the one hand, it's common sense, it's a simple truth that we have only one Torah, says the Rebbe, Hine, ha'achtus sheba Where in the Torah itself do you see the unity within the Torah? Nidgeshes v'nivletes is emphasized and is more brought forward, is more bold, is easier to see. More in Chassidus you see Achdus in Torah, because the whole Chassidus is Achdus. That's what Chassidus is about. It's really about unity. In other parts of Torah you don't see, the unity is there, but you don't see it. So the Rebbe says, when you make a yeshiva that's in the Madreg of Kedusha, which parallels Atzilus, and has the Shaykhs to Chassidus, so it has the Shaykhs to Achdus. Or Kumei Shal Pi Pasha, just like we say very simply, that in Pnimius HaTorah, Kabbalah and Chassidus, Ein Sham Inyan Shal Machlekes, there is not division. There are differences in Kabbalah. There are differences in Kabbalah. But it's incomparable, says the Rebbe. You can't compare the degree of divisions that you have in Nigla de Torah, in Halacha, to the divisions that you have in Pnimius HaTorah. And the reason this is so has to go to do with the root. What is the root? The root of it is it's the tree of life, rather than the tree of good and evil. Like it says in Tanya, the 26th letter in Tanya. So because in its root, Pnimius HaTorah is called the tree of life, rather than the tree of knowledge, therefore, moving Mamela, that's why when it comes down into the level of learning, Leis Tamon in Pnimius HaTorah, there isn't like kasha, no questions that have no answers, and no divisions that are insoluble. Ayin Shom Bezeir, it says in Zayir, and it's explained in Tanya. Now, just a short thought. I guess I'll put it to you this way, so I'll sort of get your attention. The Arizal was a great Makubal. There's no way to describe who the Arizal was. We know nothing about him. He lived physically. But from what his students say about him, he was something extraordinary. Even in a world of giants, he made them all look like pygmies to him. Arizal was unbelievably great. Arizal. And Arizal didn't really write. Arizal said he couldn't write, because writing requires a tzimtzum, a concentration of his thoughts. He would work very hard to find words to speak to his disciples. Mishageir, he worked hard to contract his thoughts, to find language to talk. But he couldn't write, but his students wrote. And the classic name of the classic Sefer of the Arizal is Eitz Chaim. Sefer numero uno, that is called Eitz Chaim, the tree of life. Who wrote the Sefer Eitz Chaim? Rabbi Chaim Vital. Chaim Vital was the prize, the favorite. The Arizal called him. He said he's the only one who should really write, even though others wrote anyway, but he was told by the Arizal that he has to be the one to transcribe his teaching. And his classic work is called Eitz Chaim. What's not known is that Rachav wrote a second Sefer, which he called Eitz Hadas Toiv. I have it. What's the difference between Eitz HaChaim and Eitz Hadas Toiv? Not Eitz Hadas Toiv, but Eitz Hadas Toiv. Eitz Chaim is Kabbalah. Eitz Hadas Toiv is Nigla. Because the difference between Pnimius HaTorah and Nigla Torah is the difference between Eitz HaChaim and Eitz Hadas, the tree of life and the tree of knowledge. Now let's understand what that means. When you learn Kabbalah and Chassidus, as some of us do, a little bit, you're entering into a world that's so peaceful. Kabbalah and Chassidus is wonderful except for one thing. It's not this world. It's exotic. It's beautiful. It's a holy environment, a holy world. When you learn Nigla, you're learning about the challenges of the real world. On Aganev, you have all kinds of people who are doing bad things, and you have to figure it all out and iron it all out and disconfuse it all and so on. Disentangle it all. So Pnimius HaTorah raises you to a place of peace. Nigla the Torah brings the truth of Hashem to the place of Toiv Ra, of good and evil. So it says in the Zohar, and it's explained in Tanya, that there's two Torahs. This Pnimius HaTorah, the Neshama of Torah, which is Eitz HaChaim, the tree of life, it speaks about Hashem's wisdom on a level above the world. And then you have Nigla the Torah, which is called Eitz Hadas Teva Ra, The tree of knowledge allows you to know and to discern and to have clarity about the inyanim of Tevara. Eitz Hadas Tevara, the tree of knowledge of good and evil. You understand? So Nigla the Tevara is called Eitz Hadas Tevara, and Pnimis is called Eitz Chaim. So Alter Rebbe in Tanya struggles with this, and he says very clearly, it's not like Eitz Hadas Tevara is a mix of good and evil. Eitz Hadas Tevara is Torah, and Torah is a lakus. But it discusses Tevara. Eitz Hadas Tevara doesn't mean that the Eitz Hadas Tevara has or is good and evil. It addresses Tevara, but it itself is above the Tevara. Eitz Chaim doesn't even talk about Tevara. Eitz Chaim talks only about life. So you have these two Teras. So the Rebbe makes the argument, Bechlal Teira is Achdus, but the Torah of Eitz Chaim, which is higher than the Torah of Eitz Hadas Tevara, is certainly Achdus. And the idea that there is a Torah, which is called Eitz Chaim, which has to do with Achdus, is the Madrega of Kedusha, is the Madrega of Atzilus, and it explains how important and how special it is in today's times, as the Rebbe puts it, to create a Moisid, which is Altaras HaKodesh, which is purely holy. And let's continue. Ubefrat biyameinu eila de ikves de Mashiach. More specifically, in our times, that we're talking about the heel of Mashiach, Asher Korev Keis Golusenu, we're very near to the edge of our goals. Ubias Mashiach Tzedkenu, the coming of Mashiach Tzedkenu. Hare alachas kama v'kama, how much more so? Shegodol, it is great. Inyan havoas eir, the idea of bringing light. And when the Rebbe says light, it doesn't mean stam Yiddishkeit. He means Yiddishkeit with the Varmkeit, and with the Freilichkeit, and with the Lebedigkeit, and with the Amunah of Chasidus. L'makam Chadash, to a new place. Or befrat kish meviyam hamoir, when you bring the source, which is called Makar Er, the source for light. I want to tell you a story. I've told the story so many times, and recently I was brought to my attention that the story, as I know it, may not even be true. You hear a story and you just assume it's true. Because I know my source. I have a very good source, a very reliable source. But apparently it's a bit of a misnomer. Nicht Punkt. But I'll tell you two stories. The first story I read in a non-Lubavitch book. Don't shoot me. Don't shoot me. There's a book called The Saving of the Belzer Rebbe. The Belzer community gave it a big book in English. I'm sure it was originally in Hebrew. I read it in English. About how they saved the Holy Belzer, Rabbi Paltiel. He was a godly man. He was a godly man. He was Isha Lakim Kodesh, you have no idea. The Heilige Belzer, the holy Belzer Rebbe. The Baron of Belz. He passed away in 1957. He's gone more than 60 years. The current Belzer Rebbe is his brother's son. When the Heilige Belzer passed, he was 7. He was a baby. So they have this book on how he survived the Holocaust. He had 63 family members. 63. It means a wife, children-in-law, and grandchildren. And he lost everyone. Everyone! He came to Eretz Yisrael Aridi with nothing. He came with his brother. They both remarried. His brother had a son. That's the current Belzer Rebbe. He's now around 70 years old. And the Rebbe remarried, but he never had children. He was a godly man. He was a malach. Mamash a malach. A malach alakim. The Rebbe talked about him with such reverence. I heard from a very reliable source. When the Rebbe became Rebbe, he made it his personal business that every sicha and every maimer and every public letter he wrote, a copy was sent to the Belzer Rebbe. The Rebbe considered it a personal. He wanted the Belzer to see what he's doing. Now the Belzer was blind. He couldn't read. But the Belzer didn't have to see to see. He didn't have to see to see. He could see without seeing. Literally. The Heilige Belzer. Belzer. Anyway, so in this book, on the Saving of the Rebbe, there's a long introduction. 100 pages in this time. And the introduction is the history of Belz. The Belz is 4 Rebbes. This is the 5th Rebbe of Belz. There was a Rabbi Shalom of Belz, there was a Yeshua of Belz, there was a Rabbi Sachadeva of Belz, and there was a Baron of Belz. It's a very prominent, a very respectable, a very honorable, very successful Hasidus. The second Belzer Rav was Rabbi Shia LeBelz. They call him the Mittel Eruv. Like we have the Mittel Rev, the Mittel Eruv. Rabbi Shua of Belz created an organization for outreach. And in a lot of ways, we follow them. The Rebbe Rashab followed the Belzerov, Rabbi Shua of Belz. He made an organization called Machazike Hadas to strengthen Yiddishkeit. He didn't make it for Hasidim. He made it for people who were, so to speak, falling away. They had newspapers. They had events to be Makadav Yidden Poshet, Rabbi Shila Belzer. So he was an Askin. He passed away in 1894. He passed away in 1894. So you understand how long ago he made this Machazike. The Rebbe Rashab made in Russia an organization called Machazike Hadas. I gamble, I would bet that he took the name from the same name. The Belzerov's organization in Galicia was called Machazike Hadas. The Rebbe Rashab made in Russia Machazike Hadas. It became what is now called Agudas Yisrael. That's another story. But originally it was called Machazike Hadas. So he was an Askan. He was not just a Rebbe for his community. He had a world view. Jews started coming to America after the Civil War. Right? The Civil War was the 1860s. After the Civil War, the 1880s, the pogroms, the millions of Jews who came to America, they came from Russia. They started in the 1880s, 1870s, 1880s. During the Civil War, the whole America had 5,000 Jews. There was no anti-Semitism. There was no Semites to be anti. 5,000 Jews in ganz America. They stayed in the census. But the Yidden started coming en masse later. And they came to America because life was very, very hard. Most of them were illiterate. They were farmers. They were simple people. And America was a land of opportunity. But it took away their hishama. It ate them up. Their souls were gone. They came here. They worked like slaves. All they wanted was that the children should have a better life. The children went to public school. The public school system in America is one of the great gifts of America. And then if they were able to afford, they went on to university. But Shabbos, kosher, mikveh, tefillin, out the window. And they understood that this was a problem. So once there was a significant presence of Jews in America, they sent a delegation to the Belzer Rebbe. And saying to the Belzer Rebbe, we need leadership in America, that we shouldn't lose our identity. And the holy Belzer, Rabbi Shua of Belz, said to them, quote, the light of the Baal Shem Tov is not in America. So I can't send from my Hasidim. The light of the Baal Shem Tov is not in America. So I cannot send from my Hasidim. Go to the Misnagdim. Maybe they'll send you G'daylim. So they went to the basic Elchanan of Kovna, the Kovna of Yeshiva University. It's called Yeshivas Rabbeinu Yitzchak Elchanan. This is the reason. He was a Litvish. He lived in Russia. He was a real gadol. He wasn't just a big Talmud Chacham. He was an activist. He was a public servant. He worked hand in hand with the Lubavitcher Rebbeim, the Marash. And they came to Rabbi Elchanan and they said, we need G'daylim in America. So we sent them RJJ, Rabbi Yankiv Yosef. Yankiv Yosef Reinis. You know, the yeshiva in Troy is called Reinis Yeshiva. Where does the name Reinis come from? In the 1890s, they sent here Rabbi Yankiv Yosef Reinis. He was a big Talmud Chacham. He was a Litvish Rid, a Gon and a Godel. And he came to America. And he was the first great scholar to be on the shores of the United States. And they killed him. They brought him here, and they were so cruel to him. And when he died, 1 million people attended his funeral. You want to know what American Jews are? You take a rabbi, you flick him, and when he dies, you give him kavod. That's the story. He fought battles for kashrus. He was a misnagid. I mean, I would imagine had he been a chassid, he would have fought battles for chinuch, children. America at one point had more yeshivas than day schools. Could you imagine? If you were an adult and you were still from, you had a place to learn. If you were a child, you had to go to public school. He fought battles for kashrus. He passed away probably 1915 on Erech. This is the story. But the word that I wanted to bring out was that the Belzer of Rabbi Shua Belzer said, I cannot send my Hasidim because the light of the Baal Shem Tov is not in America. This is one story. In the 1940s, the Rebbe had a Fabrengen. And the Rebbe said to a Chassidish Yid, Nishka Lubavitcher, why doesn't your father, the father was a Gutarid, was a Rebbe, bring his Chassidim to the Frierdiker Rebbe? Why did he bring his Mispalim to the Frierdiker Rebbe? And he said to this man, if your father knew that the Baal Shem Tov was in the United States, would he send his people to see the Baal Shem Tov? He says, of course. He says, go tell your father that the Baal Shem Tov lives in New York. And his address is 770 Eastern Parkway on the second floor. And he should bring his people to see the Baal Shem Tov. Now, why am I telling this story? Because the Belzerov said literally 60 years earlier, the Oira Baal Shem Tov is not in America. I can't send my people. The Baal Shem Tov is not in America. And then the Rebbe says Baal Shem Tov came to America. What do I want to add? When the Rebbe sent Shluchim to Kol Katzvei Tevel, they took a piece of Rebbe with them. Shluchei Shalom Kamoisai. How do you say about a Yid? A nice guy. Shluchei Shalom Kamoisai. Real, the Rebbe sends you on a shlichus. You're the Rebbe. You're a prostitute. You can make mistakes, and you get involved in politics, and you can hurt people, and you can hurt yourself, and you can hurt your moistus. Yeah. Bepnimis Anyonim. In truth, wherever the Rebbe sends the shliach, the Rebbe is. And I think that's the spirit of this. That when you open up a moistus in Australia, based on Kedusha, this is the Baal Shem Tov in Australia. But the Baal Shem Tov was never in Australia. And for the Gemara, when you go with the koyach of the Mishaleach, of the Rebbe, to those places, you bring the Rebbe to those places. And when you have the Baal Shem Tov in Australia, then you can have Kedusha. You can have Atzilus in Australia. Okay, I'm going to stop now.